Hello and welcome to the Intellects Co. I'm Colin Fairley. I'm a pragmatist philosopher and political theorist based at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario, Canada. And in today's video, I'm going to be doing a dive into the second part of my video description of Chapter 4 of my book, Aging and the Ethics of Longevity Science. Chapter 4 is entitled Imagination and Idealism After the COVID-19 Pandemic. In the previous video on this chapter, I discussed the role of imagination both within science and more broadly for bioethical discussions of the societal significance of translational science. And in the following video after this one, I will describe some of the amazing science that is undertaken in the last century with respect to modulating the biology of aging. This video is titled Christian Herter on the Plasticity of Science. And I'm going to describe one of the gems I discovered in my 10 years of working on this book, an article published in JAMA back in 1910 on the role of imagination in medical science. So this is the article. I can't actually recall how I came across it. I've never seen anybody cite this article in JAMA from 1910. I was going through the archives of a number of scientific journals, just looking at what were the issues that medical science was fixating on in the early 20th century. And this article in JAMA caught my attention with the title Imagination and Idealism in the Medical Sciences. And it was one of those eureka moments for an author where you see somebody else, working a century before you who was already articulating the ideals that you've been trying to piece together. And it was like a piece of the missing puzzle was brought together by Herter. So I wanted to do more research into Christian Herter himself and then find a way in which I could utilize the insights of his article to frame the societal significance of translational gerontology. So a little bit about Herter. Herter was born in 1865. As we're going to see, unfortunately, he died at a relatively young age of only 45 from a neurological disorder. He was homeschooled by his father, who was an artist and an architect. And at the tender age of 15, he began his medical degree at Columbia University. Herter also had a laboratory built into his house, right? So he was not only a physician, he was an experimental scientist. And he helped to co-found the Journal of Biological Chemistry. And as I mentioned, tragically, he died only a few months after his JAMA presidential address on the role of imagination in idealism in medical science. Here we see the obituary in the New York Times. Physicians mourn Dr. Herter's death. Distinguished scientist who studied deeply the chemical aspects of disease. He had a laboratory in his home, and he made researches into preventative side of medicine and solved new problems in the Rockefeller Institute. The main insight of Herter that I appropriate for my argumentation concerns a distinction between what he describes as humanitarian medicine, which is the orientation to focus on the direct and obvious paths of ameliorating human suffering, and then a second path, the indirect way of promoting health, which is celebrated through curiosity-oriented medical science and an investigation into pure science, such as chemistry and physics. And this prioritizes the experimental method. And Herter argued that both of these approaches were very important, but there was often some misunderstanding and even outright opposition that proponents of humanitarian medicine would have to the orientation towards curiosity-oriented medical science. Now, the exemplary example of curiosity-oriented medical science that Herter focused on, he actually published a book on Louis Pasteur. So Pasteur was a chemist rather than a physician, and his PhD thesis was on the fermentation of wine and the crystals that would be formed in that process. And that was scientific research that had no clear medical application. But because Pasteur was an experimentalist who pursued his passion for pure science, eventually this research led to milk pasteurization, and Pasteur also developed vaccines for rabies and anthrax. So Louis Pasteur is a great example of an experimentalist who studied pure science, that initially there was no obvious medical utility that would come from that research, and yet some of the biggest innovations in public health and medicine during the time of Pasteur's life came from this experimental research. I want to juxtapose two visions of medical science that we find in early public health pioneers. Charles Winslow, most people in medical science know about Charles Winslow. He was the first director of Yale University's School of Public Health. He authored The War Against Disease, published in 1903. His definition of public health in the Untilled Fields of Public Health is the iconic definition of public health, published in Science in 1920 as the art and science of disease prevention and prolonging life. Unfortunately, Christian Herter is mostly forgotten about, but I would put him of equal importance to Charles Winslow. And Herter's approach prioritizes the role of experimental science in the study of pure science. And this juxtaposition between the importance of applied and pure science is something integral to wisdom inquiry science, which sees both of these things as trying to solve the problems of living. Whereas many proponents of humanitarian medicine see the study of pure science in its experimental form as just a distraction from addressing the concerns of applied medical science. Now, Winslow, as I've already argued in many other videos, was critical in getting the steamship of public health to make serious progress up the ocean of longevity. He proposed that public health adopt a protean approach, meaning it could rapidly change the strategies it deploys to address the risks that were the leading causes of mortality for human populations at the time. So initially, this is going to be tuberculosis, cholera, dysentery, and smallpox. And as public health makes success in reducing, though not eliminating, most of these mortality risks, new diseases emerge. And then the protean approach, you target each of those diseases with the empirically oriented strategy for redressing their health risks, right? And the goal, the conceptual underpinning of this war against disease is the idea that you would save lives, understood as preventing or delaying mortality. I mean, people still die, but they'll die of other causes later in the lifespan. So the protean approach of public health was to target each disease one at a time. And this, as I argue in the tale of the journey through the ocean of longevity, is like the ship's captain who's been steering this course. It's served us very well in stage one of the tale, where we've been able to reduce the high rates of early life mortality from infectious disease and poverty, but it has diminishing health dividend for older populations surviving into late life because of the prevalence of multimorbidity that occurs during the upper bounds of the human lifespan. So Winslow's articulation invokes certain ideals, the ideal of a disease-free world, or that public health was purchasable, and through hygiene and economic development, you could eradicate certain diseases, if not all of them. And while there's been a lot of sage insights that have come from this paradigm, there's also severe limitations when it comes to populations that are surviving beyond the 7th decade of life. Now, by contrast, Herter's articulation of the ideals of public health are less well known, and so I want to amplify the insights that Herter also championed to supplement Winslow's war against disease. Herter, as I noted, made a distinction between humanitarian medicine, that is the direct ways of trying to ameliorate human suffering, and experimental science. And when we think about this in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020, initially what was primed was humanitarian medicine, that is the known ways of reducing transmission for infectious diseases. So this would be quarantine of the sick, the wearing of face masks, social distancing, etc. But the real big game changer came in the form of vaccinations, and the research for the mRNA vaccinations for COVID-19 went back many decades And it wasn't clear that there would actually be a practical payoff for the experimental research on those vaccines in that area, but then it became manifest as a vaccine during the COVID-19 pandemic. So I have a tortoise and a hare represented, contrasting these two different approaches to promoting health. Humanitarian medicine is the approach of the rabbit. It quickly, jumps into the race. And these are the strategies that are the known, tested, and tried for reducing the health vulnerabilities human populations face. And the tortoise is a slow and steady approach. It's the approach of experimental science. It's the possible or the imagined versus the actual and the real. And while not all of the experimental science will come to fruition as empirically valid interventions to promote human health, all we need is a few dramatic breakthroughs to make a significant impact on improving the health prospects of human populations. And what I want to suggest is that the experimental science in the 21st century that is so critical to the health of aging populations is represented by translational gerontology, that for 100 years, research on the biology of aging has been slowly progressing like the tortoise, going from the bench to the clinic, and hopefully the realization of healthy longevity for the 2 billion humans that'll be over age 60 by the middle of this century. And Herter noted that there's pros and cons with humanitarian experimental science. And one of the downsides of priming humanitarian medicine too much is that it often leads people to be critical of experimental science. They see it as a distraction or a waste of resources, right? Just focus on the tried and proven ways of ameliorating human suffering. Don't worry about investing in things that may never come to fruition. And if we adopted that approach, we would never have made progress in abating the risks from infectious disease through vaccination, for example. The only tools we would have had were the original tools of quarantine of the sick. We wouldn't have developed vaccinations. And I argue the same approach can apply to healthy aging. As we'll see in a moment, there are things that you can do right now to facilitate increasing one's health span, but there's also likely to be profound breakthroughs made from experimental science in terms of developing geroprotective drugs that boost our biological resilience to disease, frailty, and disability in late life. So I argue that healthy aging really is the manifestation of this experimental science in the 21st century. It's being described in this article in Science in 2015 as the ultimate preventative medicine. And there's both the non-pharmacological component, which represents humanitarian medicine, and the pharmacological, the prospect of intervening pharmacologically, which represents the branch of experimental science, but is quickly moving from the bench to the clinic. I believe that the war against disease now represents humanitarian medicine. It is the tried and tested way of reducing preventable mortality. But geroscience represents the experimental science, and just as Herter noted, some of the strongest opposition to experimental science comes from advocates of humanitarian medicine. And so researchers that study specific diseases like Alzheimer's, cancer, heart disease, and stroke will often have resistance or see it as, threats to the integrity of their science if researchers on aging are claiming that they should be getting more resources to study the biology of aging, given that for cancer and Alzheimer's, for example, age is the biggest risk factor for those specific diseases, and also for COVID-19 mortality. So I think the future is really about thinking about how experimental science can harness insights from the biology of aging to increase health span and compress the period of time we manage multimorbidity, disability, and frailty in late life. And this will require us to cultivate the correct dispositions to experimental science that's moving us towards the realization of healthy longevity to narrow that growing gap, which is nearly 10 years globally, between health span and lifespan. So this is my favorite passage from Herter. I'm going to read this passage, and I believe it's a way in which we can make concrete our understanding about how experimental gerontology has been progressing for over a century, from early experiments on caloric restriction in rodents to the development of drugs to be tested in humans. Herter claims, "I like to think of medicine in our day as an ever-broadening and deepening river, fed by the limpid streams of pure science. The river at its borders has its eddies and currents, expressive of certain doubts and errors that fringe all progress, but it makes continuous advances on the way to the ocean of its destiny. Very gradual has been the progress of its widening and deepening, for it is a product of human ingenuity and artifice, and only skilled engineers could direct the isolated currents of science into the somewhat sluggish stream of medical utility." All right, this passage captures beautifully what I'm trying to convey in the tale of the ocean, of the journey through the ocean of longevity. All right, so there's a parallel metaphor about water and slow progress. So I would conjecture that research and development for achieving healthy longevity is pursuing this trajectory that Herter describes for experimental science. This goes all the way back to caloric restriction in the 1930s through the era of genetic manipulation of lifespan in the 1980s to the development of identifying particular molecules that can significantly increase median lifespan and health span in experimental laboratory animals. So today, I believe that translational gerontology represents this ever-broadening and deepening river. It has its setbacks, but slowly it's etching closer and closer to being a reality. And I contend that that is a morally laudable aspiration to pursue. And we should be investing more and more of our resources into this experimental arm of translational gerontology to reduce the growing health span lifespan gap. This is an image I utilized in the book. It originally was published in an article that I published in the Royal Society's Open Science. And I'll just kind of expand a little bit on some of these points. So there's a picture of Christian Herter and his distinction between humanitarian and curiosity-oriented science. And both of these apply to how we engage our idealism with respect to healthy aging. So for humanitarian medicine, there are things that people can pursue right now to try to increase their health span and delay the onset of age-related diseases and disability and frailty. So this would be the non-pharmacological interventions that already exist, right? So stop smoking, exercise, eat better, campaign for a more equitable distribution of the social determinants of health, improving the living conditions and abating ageism, which unfortunately is prevalent in many domains of our culture, improving long-term care, etc. So this is the humanitarian medicine expression of geriatric medicine and gerontology. But there's also the experimental arm, right? So somebody might be very supportive of this component, but as Herter warns, some of the strongest advocates of humanitarian medicine are big critics of the experimental arm of medical innovation because they see it as a threat or distraction from the tried and tested ways of improving human health. And so in the article, I emphasize the curiosity-oriented approach. This reveals the indirect ways of winning what Herter refers to as the citadel of health. And I conjecture that actually the geroscience hypothesis, which maintains that we will be able to develop drugs to slow down the mechanisms of aging, to prolong the health span and compress morbidity in late life, is a central aspiration that we should prioritize for the health of aging populations living in the 21st century. That will be the focus of the next video to complete the videos that I'm going to post on Chapter 4 of my book. So that is the end of what I want to say for this video. We heard a little bit about Christian Herter. It's tragic that he died at only age 45. I think he would have made other really important contributions to medical science. But if you're really interested in the history of imagination and idealism in medical science, I would love to see Herter's article get the more citations and factor into our deliberations and discussions in a more serious way. It's a brilliant piece. It deserves to be taken seriously in the 21st century. In the next video, which will be the last one on chapter 4, I'm going to describe in a little bit more detail the century of research on the biology of aging.